Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about how copyright deals with generic elements that might be incorporated into a work of authorship. So when authors create works of authorship, typically they don't do it in a vacuum, right? They create work of authorship in relation to previously existing works of authorship. And specifically, they typically create works of authorship in one or more genres of works. In other words, they use elements that are conventional within a particular genre or a particular community in order to express their new ideas in a format that people find convenient, familiar, and easy to understand. In addition, they may use some expressions that are conventional within the genre and are familiar to people and not necessarily the kinds of expressions that we want to see protected by copyright. So copyright has developed a set of doctrines that courts use kind of like heuristics to sort of identify elements of works of authorship that aren't properly the subject of copyright protection. So on one level, we can look at this as just an iteration of the distinction between original and not original works of authorship. In other words, if something copied, then it can't be an original element and therefore can't be protected. But it also kind of fits into the idea expression dichotomy as well, in the sense that sometimes the elements or the relationship between the elements of a work are sufficiently kind of abstract or sufficiently like ideas that we don't want to see them being protected by copyright because we think that protecting them would be too restricting on the ability of other people to speak in the same area. Right, so we can start to see the kind of convergence between the originality requirement and the idea expression dichotomy as a kind of framing way of thinking about what copyright can and should protect and what copyright doesn't and shouldn't protect. And specifically, courts and commentators tend to think of these in relation to many different categories. Some of the relevant ones would be the scenes of fair doctrine, the merger doctrine, and the short phrases doctrine. So broadly speaking, the scenes of fair doctrine says that you can't claim copyright ownership over generic elements of a work of authorship or elements of a work of authorship that place it within or derive from the genre in which the work is created. And it just means kind of scenes that you have to do, things that have to be included, right? Generic elements of a work of authorship, things that you have to do in order for the audience of the work to recognize it as being part of the genre in which the work is created. And the idea there is that, like, you know, because you're doing those things in order to signal to the consumer of the work the nature of the genre, you're not really creating something new, you're copying it from somewhere else. And you're also making or including that element in order to convey to consumers ideas that are kind of constitutive to what it is you're trying to convey in the work itself. In other words, we try to distinguish between these kinds of abstract generic elements that are used in order to frame the work from the actually original novel elements that constitute the new work itself. And the scenes of fair doctrine, it's kind of an effort on the part of courts and commentators to distinguish between the two, to sort of draw a line between, or a fuzzy line perhaps, between the elements of a work that are protectable and the elements that aren't. The merger doctrine, by contrast, says that really simple elements of a work can't be protected. And it kind of goes to the atomistic quality of copyright protection. I mean, insofar as we think of copyright protection as going to the elements of the work and not necessarily to the work as a whole, at some point an element has to get small enough that it's no longer protectable by copyright, which sort of passes the copyright threshold, as it were, right? And the merger doctrine really goes to that, to say that, you know, if a work or if an element of a work doesn't include enough expressive content, or the expressive content of the work is reducible to just the idea itself, the idea it's expressing, it's sort of the most efficient way of expressing a really basic idea, then that's not the kind of element that ought to be protectable in the first place. And the short phrases doctrine is kind of similar. And some people think it's not really a doctrine at all, really more just a way of saying that short phrases don't include enough content to be original, and therefore they shouldn't be protectable in the first place. But it also goes to this idea that short phrases are simply not the kind of thing that copyright was intended to protect in the first place. They sort of enter into the vernacular, they're used in a range of different ways. They might be distinctive and therefore protectable in the trademark sense, but they don't seem like the kind of original expressive content that we want to see protected by copyright. So let's look at a couple of examples to think about how that works in practice. A really classic one is the Nichols v. Universal Pictures case, an old learned hand decision. And it involved a play and a movie, right? So the play, the Coens and the Kellys, involved a classic, frankly, kind of stereotypical, very stereotypical story about a relationship between the children of a Jewish family and an Irish Catholic family, and the tensions that arose in the context of that relationship. And it was very popular on Broadway, right? It spoke to the cultural moment, apparently, and you know, it was very popular. A lot of people went to see it, and it was a very successful and lucrative play for the writer and producer. And Universal Pictures realized that this was a, you know, kind of the moment story, and decided to produce their own version of the same story, and specifically produced a motion picture titled A.B.'s Irish Rose, which was, you know, on one level, kind of a broad level, very similar in the sense that it involved a, you know, Jewish family and Irish Catholic family and relationship between the children of those two families and the tensions, resolution of those tensions. And it was a relatively successful film as well. And so the author of the play, or rather the producers of the play, the Coens and the Kellys, brought a copyright infringement action against Universal on the ground that the motion picture infringed on their copyright in the play. And ultimately, the circuit court decided against the plaintiff on the ground that what the defendants had copied, if anything, and there was no, you know, conclusive determination of whether the defendants had copied, although under the circumstances, it was pretty clear that they had seen the popularity of one play and wanted to replicate that play in their motion picture. So presumably some form of copying was taking place. The court essentially said that to the extent that anything was copied, what they'd copied was not material that was actually copyrightable. In other words, they'd copied generic material. They'd copied what the court referred to as scenes affaire, right? They'd copied the elements that were necessary in order to tell the kind of story, the kind of generic story that was at stake, but they didn't copy the elements, in effect, that made the Coens and Kellys distinctive, right? In other words, they created their own story that was similar to, but sufficiently different from the Cohens and the Kellys as to make it non-infringing. And the court really, pointed to some interesting distinctions in order to kind of frame the way it was thinking about the problem. And among other things, it kind of famously said that a plagiarist can't point to what they didn't copy in order to protect themselves from a copyright infringement claim, right? But at the same time, a copyright owner can't allege infringement on the ground that somebody copied generic elements that implicitly weren't original to the person who created the play in question. In other words, once again, what we really see here is the copyright owner of the Cohens and the Kellys really objecting to competition, right? Somebody else telling a similar story, not so much objecting to somebody actually copying the story they told, right? They didn't want anyone using the genre or like writing in the same space than themselves, even though that person, the Universal Pictures film, didn't copy the specific story that they actually told. Okay, so in Morrissey v. Procter and Gamble, we see a sort of different kind of problem presented, one more kind of sounding in the merger doctrine. So what happened here, Morrissey proposed a set of rules for essentially a kind of a raffle involving products, right? A set of rules sort of instructing people on how to submit their materials for the purpose of entering a contest. And the Procter & Gamble company ran a contest and used really similar rules, and Morrissey sued for copyright infringement, saying, hey, their rules look a lot like our rules. The rules that I created, they shouldn't be able to do that. They more or less copied the rules that I wrote and used them as the basis for their own raffle. And the court said ultimately that because there's a limited number of ways of expressing those rules, that Morrissey can't, in effect, get a monopoly over the rules themselves simply by having written them down. In other words, there's an efficient way to express the rules, and any alternative way of expressing them would not be efficient or wouldn't be clear. Therefore, Procter & Gamble, if they want to use the rules, which they're entitled to use, right? Copyright doesn't protect the rules themselves. It can only protect a particular expression of those rules. Then it can do so even though the rules that it's written down are really similar or even identical to the ones that Morrissey wrote down, because there's really only one way to do it. And we don't want to let people claim a monopoly over a set of rules, right, through copyright, because that's really not what copyright is for. Okay. And then in the Rosenthal v. Kalpakian case, what happened was Rosenthal was in the business of, among other things, creating brooches in the shape of bees, right? And they create a wide range of different brooches. It's not entirely clear exactly which one was the subject of this particular allegation, but I've heard people suggest that this is an image, or at least close to an image, of the relevant bee brooch in question. And Kalpakian saw that these bee brooches were very successful and decided to make its own line of bee brooches. I mean, why not get in a market? If they're popular, we should be making those ourselves. And they purported to go out and kind of do research and look at different bees and think about like how to create their own sculptures, to make bee sculptures, et cetera, or bee brooches. But at the end of the day, the court kind of recognizes the reality that what Kalpakian was doing was copying the idea, right? Copying what Rosenthal had decided to do because they saw that this was, you know, a successful and lucrative product to be producing and selling. And so really at the end of the day, the court saw the question as being not just whether the Kalpakian brooch was sufficiently similar to be infringing on the Rosenthal brooch, but rather whether the Rosenthal brooch was really protectable in the first place, or rather whether the elements that the Rosenthal company was claiming were protectable in the first place. I mean, after all, the Rosenthal company wasn't alleging that Kalpakian was creating literal copies of their brooch that people would confuse with the Rosenthal brooch. Rather, they were complaining that Kalpakian was creating similar bee-shaped brooches that, you know, were sufficiently close that people might see them as acceptable substitutes, maybe, even though they weren't identical and they weren't confused about where they were coming from. So we can start to see some sort of overlap between copyright and trademark here. Once again, really the dispute is really about competition, not so much necessarily about copying, because we don't see literal copying. We see copying of the idea that enables competition in the marketplace. And ultimately, what the Ninth Circuit concluded was that Rosenthal was, in a sense, overclaiming, right? The implicit sort of conclusion is, you know, they can claim copyright protection in the particular brooch design that they actually created, but what they can't claim is copyright protection in bee brooches in general, right? They can't claim kind of abstract protection of bee brooches and prevent Kalpakian from competing in the market. All they can claim is copyright protection over the particular design, the particular brooch that they actually created under the circumstances.